Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening, everybody? How you doing today out there? Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Podtastic Audio. I am Chris from the Chris and Christine Show podcast. You can find that at chrisandchristineshow.com, and that is Chris and Christine, both with the letter K. So, hey, I know you got a podcast, or maybe you're thinking about doing a podcast, but you're like, how do I get the audio to sound spectacular? Well, through the course of this podcast here, I am going to show you what I have done to create the Chris and Christine Show. Now, I know there's thousands of ways to make a podcast, and there's a bunch of different audio editing software programs you can use, just like there's tons of microphones you can use, just like there's tons of like everything pretty much, you know? It's like there's a bunch of cars on the road, but everybody claims that their car is the best. I mean, if you look at the commercials for all of the manufacturers, it's just with anything really. So what I'm going to show you is that the things that we have done, the tools that we have used are free for the most part. The only thing I would say the most expensive part of creating a podcast that I'm going to show you is probably the microphone. And I showed you in the last episode that you can get a microphone as cheap as $20. So $20 is really your expenses you've spent so far, pretty much on this podcast adventure. So now what I'm going to talk about in this episode and probably a couple more episodes, this might be part one of a multiple course on how to do editing. Now I know people get freaked out when it comes to editing their podcast because it can go in either two extremes. Like you got the guy that'll spend like 10 hours editing a 30-minute podcast. Like every little thing will get in there with a fine-tooth razor blade and take out every little thing, and he'll rearrange stuff and maybe add a ton of special effects and sound effects and all that fancy stuff, and you're spending 10 hours doing it. Or you get the guy on the other end where he just records it in whatever platform he uses, doesn't really matter, and then he just sends it up to his hosting site as is. He probably doesn't even listen back to it, and he just sends it off to the world. The problem with that is that it probably sounds like crap because he didn't edit it or even listen back. I mean, he may have not even done it with headphones on, and then you listen back to it, and you realize there was like this buzzing sound in the background the entire time, or it had this really bad echoey sound, and it was there, and the person listening probably heard it and was like, what is this crap? And they may have turned it off. So editing is important, I would say. It's very, very important. But what we've done when we edit our show is it's a lot of many-step process to do it. And I don't try to do it all in one take, although I have done that before and spent many hours after we recorded, up into the wee hours of the evening, editing the podcast and getting it ready for everyone to listen to it. So if you heard me say anything, we use Audacity for our audio editing and recording. Audacity is completely free. It's a free download. You just download it, it's on your computer, and it works great. There's a lot of fancy tools for editing you can do with it, and it's not that complicated. I know editing sounds really hard and sounds really, really complicated. So, as I said, Audacity. Now, Audacity first came out, it looks like it started in the fall of 1999, but is actually released in May of the year 2000. So I guess the next year they had it up and running. Now, as of October 24th, I like that day, of 2020, it was the most popular download from FossHub. FossHub, I guess, is the company that has Audacity, and it has over 120 million downloads, it says. It won the SourceForge 2007 and 2009 Community Choice Award for Best Project for Multimedia. So Audacity is basically a digital audio workstation, or DAW for short, and it's free to get, and I believe it works on Windows, Linux, Apple, and the big players, really. You can download it. It's a free download. I recommend getting Audacity for all of your audio work stuff, and it's free. I'm going to say it again. It is free to use Audacity. Now, I've been using Audacity since the very, very beginning, so I can't speak on other editing software programs or how to really use them because I haven't used those. I've only used Audacity. So it's pretty easy to download to your computer. Once you have it, you can record directly into it, and you can edit directly on it. Now, when it comes to the recording, there are some limitations with it. One big issue with the recording is that you cannot record multiple recording inputs like tracks at the same time. It looks like it only records in stereo. So you got two channels, left and right, you can record into live at the same time. Say you have a room of, say, 4 you guys doing a podcast, and each of you guys want to be on your own separate tracks. You cannot record directly into Audacity with 4 you guys, one on each track. So track 1, 2, 3, and 4. You cannot record live into it that way. You can edit 4 tracks at the same time. We'll have to get in that later, but I'm saying just for far as recording live, it will not handle multi-track recording. But there is a way around that. I'm sure there's a plugin you can get, but there's a way that we have done is we have a USB interface. It has 4 plugs on it, but like I said, it only handles 2 at a time. But if you wanted to, there is an XLR splitter you can buy. I have 2 of them. You take the XLR out inputs for the microphones. Basically, you're taking 2 microphones and you're combining them into 1 cable. And that cable goes into one side. And then you do the same thing for the other side. So now technically, you have 4 microphones going into the same interface, but only using 2 channels, left and right. Now, that is one way you can record multiple people into Audacity at the same time. You guys will not be on separate channels. 2 of you will be on one channel, and the other 2 of you will be on the other channel, left side, right side. Okay, so assuming you got all the track laid down, you got it already recorded, now it's time for the editing part. Now, editing can be very, very scary for a lot of people. The way that I have done it, there's basically a few simple little tricks in Audacity for editing that I would get very, very familiar with. One is the undo button. It's in the top corner of it under editing, I believe. If you make a mistake while you're editing, you go up there and you hit the undo. It's going to do the undo of whatever the last thing you did was. And I think it goes back as far, I haven't tested how far back you can go, but you can go back multiple layers behind you of this mistake, that last mistake, the mistake before that, there's the mistake before that. And then you can keep doing that to get back to where you started if you really want to go back that far. And the next thing I'm going to tell you about is one tool that I got familiar with right away, and that was the trimming and deleting. Now, when you look at your audio file on this workstation or any kind of workstation, it looks like a bunch of little blobs that are up and down, little spiky little blobs written from left to right. It goes left to right, just like typing on a typewriter or you're typing up a Word document. That's the way the audio is written down. It goes left to right, and it plays the same direction. So the first thing that I figured out was that between the long pauses, if you have to think about saying something, or if your guest thinks about saying something, or your co-host, or maybe you don't talk as quickly as you would like it to sound out when you hear it back, there is a little trimming tool. It's very, very simple to use. You basically take your little mouse and you highlight the section of space that you want to remove from your podcast. It can be a word, it could be blank area, it doesn't matter. You highlight that little section, take the mouse, click on it, drag it over it, highlight it, hit delete. And when you do that, it's magically gone. But what it does is it takes the remaining podcast and it closes it together. So say, for example, your podcast was 10 minutes long, right? And you highlighted 1 minute and you hit delete. Now your podcast is 9 minutes long. it basically took that space, and not only did it remove it, it closed that gap together. So when you do that, you got to keep in mind that if you're closing words together or closing spaces between words, if you close them too quickly, it's going to sound very, very fast because now you mashed the two words together. Like if you say the phrase, the cat was in the tree, but you remove the words the, it's going to sound like cat and tree. Make sense? You could take out the word the. There's no pause there. Now, there's another thing you can do. You can do a silence instead of a delete. So instead of the cat was in the tree, instead of cutting out the word the, if you hit silence the word the, it's going to sound like the cat in the tree. It's going to be a pause there because you silence that word instead of removing it. And that is probably what takes a long time when people go through their podcast and scrub through them and try to remove all the ums and duh and things of that sort. And you can spend hours, I have personally too, spent a long time going through the podcast and removing all those things, just basically trimming and silencing. If they're too close together, you might want to silence it and then maybe trim a little bit off. Basically, what I try to do for this podcast and make it sound as natural as I possibly can. I don't take out all of the ums. I let some slide in there because I think it adds a little more natural flow and more natural, like the way we talk to the conversation. If you try to take everything out and trim it too quickly, it may make you sound like a robot or a computer or something. It wouldn't sound right. They won't sound natural. But you got to play with it and figure out what works best for you. Like I said, the first thing we did, we figured out the trimming, and then I figured out the silencing. And like I said before, if you accidentally delete the wrong thing, don't you worry. Go up to the edit and hit that undo button, and magically it's back to where it was as if you didn't even change a thing. Now that you got your podcast episode all trimmed and nice and neat exactly how you want it, if there's any other kind of sounds that are in the podcast, like say, for example, there is a low buzzing sound or humming sound, you're like, oh no, what am I going to do now? I am freaking out because I did everything I'm supposed to do. I trimmed everything, but I still hear there's like a fan is on in the background, which could possibly be the case. And there's an undertone of like a noise I hear in the background. What is that? How do I get rid of that? Well, guess what? There's a feature for that. How to remove that in Audacity. It is called noise reduction. Now, the way it works, it's a two-step process in Audacity. The way it works is that you click on noise reduction, and then it's going to ask for something called a noise profile. And what that is, it wants you to highlight with your little mouse a section of your audio, not the part you're talking, a section of blank area where you hear the noise that you want to get removed. You highlight that area, that section, give you maybe 1 or 2 seconds of it, highlight it, click on Get Noise Profile. It's going to do its thing. Then you close that, and then you reopen, then you click the Select All button, so you're selecting the entire track now. You go back into Noise Reduction, and then you click OK. Then you're going to watch it do its little thing, and what it's going to do is it's going to remove the sound that you told it to remove off the track. Now you can do a fine tune on the decibel levels of what you're looking for to remove that particular sound. Or what I usually do is keep it on a stock, like the setting it's already set for, and just run that. And it seems to work really, really good. I have gotten rid of tons of sound in the background from other people's microphones, hummings, low sounds like that off the track completely. It does a phenomenal job, and it's very, very easy to do. Once you figure that out, you're like, oh my goodness, it's great. So like I said, people can spend tons and tons of time fine trimming and editing their podcast, or you can do a very simple job. Just get like the major spots where somebody took a minute to answer a question. You can trim that up, take all that out, bring it down to like maybe a small one little beat between the words. That's the thing too. When I'm editing the podcast and I'm trimming stuff out and taking things up, silencing or trimming, I still want to try to leave a little bit of a rhythm and a beat to way people talk, because people have a rhythm to the way they talk. You kind of want to keep that rhythm going throughout the entire podcast. You don't want things too spaced out or too trimmed up, too tight together, because then it will sound very, very quick like a robot or something. So you want to keep that in mind when you're doing the editing. Try to get a good flow going to where it sounds as if you didn't edit at all. It's funny. Some of the best things in life were edited. Every major movie, every major song, every book, every good podcast, everything was edited. So don't give me this, oh, it's my art, man. I do this I just record it and throw it out there and I don't even care and blah, blah, blah. But you know what? People are going to care because they're probably not going to listen. So that's what it comes down to. Like I said, every single thing that was ever done right was edited. So keep that in mind. In editing, you don't have to go super, super detailed in every little thing, every little breath, every little, nuance, or every little other word. You can leave some of that stuff in, but just take some of the bad sections out. You can trim a lot of stuff too. And I know a lot of people don't like editing their podcasts because first it takes a lot of time, but there's ways to do it very quickly and very easily. Like the Chris and Christine show, like I would edit a lot on the first, 20, 30 episodes, maybe 50 episodes. And now I do the editing, but I mostly do the editing on our interviews we have. Because with the interviews, I don't have a lot of control of what the guests are using for their equipment or what they're going to say, things like that. We do try to tell the guests, make sure that you have a decent microphone and it's plugged in correctly and you have a quiet room. I mean, just the basic stuff. You try to tell everybody that. But some people, don't get the memo and they just think they can do it however they want to do it. So I do have to edit those out and try to work on that stuff as best I can. So also here in Audacity, there are a bunch of other tools under the effects section where you can change and fine-tune the pitch, the loudness. You can really get into the weeds of what you really want to do. Change your voice to make it sound totally different. You can play around with that if you want to. I wouldn't do that. We don't really do that much. I did a little bit play with it just to try it out, but you really can get you can really get deep into what you're doing with that stuff and make it totally sound like it's not even you, like it's somebody totally different. It may sound weird, but you can, like I said, you can play with it if you really want to. I wouldn't do that, but if you do, you don't like it, there's always that great old undo button. Get familiar with the undo button. It'll be your favorite tool in Audacity. Trust me, I've done it. I've used it all the time. So on that note, I think this will be probably part 1 of a multiple part series on how I do editing. And what I'm going to say is that editing is not that hard to do. Oh, and one more thing I forgot to tell you guys is that if you can record and upload your tracks on separate tracks for each person talking, or with just you by yourself, it's probably even better. But if there's 2 of you on the podcast, try to separate it and not record it under one channel. We started out recording it in one channel onto Audacity. So it was just one line with both of us on the same track. That's fun and all, but the problem is if one person bumps their microphone or coughs or anything like that while the other person's talking, you're not going to be able to edit that out because you can't trim one without the other if they're on the same track. If they're on separate tracks, you can go to the one that coughed. You can highlight, don't delete, but highlight that section if you have it split in mono mode for both tracks. And that was complicated. But you can highlight their cough and silence it out, or their bump or whatever. And that's exactly what we do for our podcast. When we have the guests and we try to edit the guest interviews, I take the tracks and they're all single tracks. We all have single tracks. Although Christina and I are on the same track, but the guest is on a separate track. So if the guest or us bump or cough or do anything, I can go to each side and silence out that audio before I run it through the next step. I think it probably takes me maybe like 5 steps before I'm actually done with the podcast, just in editing really alone. But I think that helps out when you actually just chunk it out into little sections, like this step you do here, this step you do there. And then you kind of save it as you go along. And when it comes to saving your podcast, I would recommend saving it as a .wav until you're finally finished with your podcast that gets completely done, ready to send up to your hosting company. At your hosting company, they require MP3s to be on their podcast hosting site. It's a little smaller, it's a compressed file. But while you're editing, you need the cleanest, clearest version of the file you can, and that would be a WAV file, .wav. And there's a special little tool that I'm going to show you guys next time that requires you to have it as a .wav, and it will make your podcast sound spectacular, amazing. This tool we use every single time. It's great. It's probably our secret weapon when it comes to making great audio for our podcast. Every single thing we have, we run through it, and it's amazing. So this is probably going to wrap it up for part 1 of editing. Basically, the basics so far, getting started with Audacity and how to really use the basic features that I have used to take care of this. And on the next podcast, I'm going to show you how to add music and package it all together. So it's going to sound spectacular, and how to save it, because you obviously got to save it in an MP3 file and then send it off to the world. And it's going to sound great. So look for part 2 of editing coming to you next time. And you guys have a fantastic week, and thanks for listening.